Welcome, everyone. My name is Zsolt Darvas. I'm a senior fellow at Bruegel, and I'm very pleased to chair our session this morning on the EU budget, its size, its composition, its financing. And I'm very privileged to have an excellent group of speakers with me. So first, let me introduce them briefly, and then I say a few introductory words. In alphabetic order, so we have Riccardo Barbieri, who is the Director General of the Italian Treasury, but he also spent a lot of time, 25 years, on the market. Then Stefani Rizzo, on my right, who is currently the Director General of the DG budget at the European Commission, but you had many previous positions elsewhere. And then Pascal Senamans, who is currently a Bruegel resident fellow. We are very pleased to have you. Before, he spent 15 years at the OECD, and he's, I think, the best-known tax expert in Europe. And last but not least, on my left, Helen Wiet den Haag, who is the Director of International Financial Affairs at the Ministry of Finance of the Netherlands. And you have been a public servant for quite long and had many different positions in different ministries. So the budget discussion already started in the previous session when Christian Odenhal asked whether the spending is wasteful, and then there was a discussion whether the size of the budget should be kept as it is, and perhaps we add more to the, or reshuffle the current budget to more focus on goods of common interest, or maybe we keep the current spending categories as they are, and we try to add something on top. And I think there was a very interesting discussion already in the introductory session. But I very much hope that with our four excellent speakers, we can go deeper into this issue. As all of you know, the first proposal for the next 7-year multi-annual EU budget will have to be prepared by the new Commission by the summer of next year. Now, we don't have yet a new Commission, so we do not yet know their priorities. So Mr. Rizzo will not be in an easy position to say what the Commission plans. In fact, she can't say what the Commission plans are, but hopefully she can offer some other useful insights. I'm sure you will, insights into what changes might be needed and might be useful to do in the next budget. So maybe let me turn directly to you. So my first question is that what are the lessons from what we currently have, both the 7-year multi-annual financial framework and Next Generation EU, including the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and what are those important lessons which you would very much suggest for the next commissioner to take on board when she or he will make a proposal for the next multi-annual budget? So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And as you said, we are in a very particular moment now. We have the political guidelines of the President. We don't yet have a College of Commissioners. So we are in this phase in which we have the duty, I would say, as the administration to provide ideas, options. So it's a very, very interesting period, and so very happy to be here now. The MFF, the current MFF and Next Generation EU is in fact very different from what we had before. It is already a massive evolution compared to what we had before. A number of indicators maybe. Unprecedented in size. We had, for the last decade, an EU budget of about 1% of GDP. Now, if you add Next Generation EU to that, you are around 1.7% of GDP. So the question on the size, whether to maintain the size, we'll have to say whether we maintain the size back to the 1% or whether we maintain the size of the current financing capacity, which is 1.7% of GDP. So the question of the size, which is always very complex, I think this time will be even more complex, because we have to say whether we drop, it's not only maintaining. So that is one element which I think is very important. Then we have today, as you mentioned, new instruments. And probably the most significant of them is the Resilience and Recovery and Resilience Facility, the RRF, the recovery plan that the EU has put in place at the time of COVID. And even if we put the financing of it, the borrowing linked to this plan, there are a number of elements that are genuinely new in this program. First, it links up reform and investment. So it's not only an investment program, and as you know, the EU budget has been mainly, since its inception, an investment budget. This time, with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, there is a focus on the reforms that were deemed important for the EU as a whole to function better, and has been declined at the national level. So there is, inspired by the European semester, there has been an integration of the different structural reforms on labor, on pension, on rule of law, on a series of very important policies. There has been an integration of this in the national plan. So there has been a tightening of the link between the EU priorities and the national priorities, and the national action plan to actually deliver on those priorities. And I think this is a very important feature of this new instrument. Then payments and achievements. It's one of the first programs that is not paid against cost, but it's paid against achievement. So only when the milestone and the targets that have been proposed by the member states, agreed with the Commission and the other member states, are met, the country is eligible to receive the money. And that is a very interesting feature also for the new EU budget. And then, of course, very important in this instrument still, the integration of the different policies. It is not one instrument for one objective. It is one instrument for the green transition, the digital transition, the resilience, and all the different national weaknesses or less performing aspects that have been put together in a coherent plan to build on the synergies and to address, when they are, trade-offs. And I think this way of doing is extremely important, especially in the current challenges, when we have a multitude of challenges that are not always easy to address at the same time, or maybe there is an optimal design of those plans if you start with some policies that will ease then the reforms after that. So these are the very important features of this new instrument, which was quite a revolution in the way the EU budget is spent. Then, of course, common borrowing, first time ever, that the EU agreed to raise debt in common for grants. And this is a major change in the financial landscape. We all know that the Recovery and Resilience Facility funding, or Next Generation EU funding, is a one-off, has been conceived as a one-off and extraordinary answer to the extraordinary challenges raised by COVID. But this has changed very much the way the EU is also perceived in the world. As Director General of Budget, we are selling the debt throughout the world, and we have changed. We see the impact it has been having on the European capital market, for example. The EU has become the 5th largest issuer in euro, and we have set up, through this instrument, also a new, very safe, very liquid asset in the European capital market. And when we come to the discussion, and I'm sure today you will come to the discussion on the Capital Market Union, you see that this instrument has been probably helping also the development on this one. Then, of course, a last element that has been a big change compared to before is the conditionality. So the linking up of the rule of law with access to EU funds, which was the first time we've done it with the conditionality regulation, with large consequences and probably a lot of success in addressing some of the rule of law deficiencies that we had seen in some member states, and still a lot of work to do. We all know where we stand there. Now, the lessons for the future. 2020, we made these big changes of the way the EU budget has been used. It's the first time the EU budget is used as a crisis answer for COVID, but also then 2 years after for addressing the financing needs of Ukraine, for addressing the energy crisis that we went through, for addressing all the different crises we went through. We had, for the first time ever, in February this year, a revision of the 7-year budget. First time ever that we revise it midterm. And still, if you look at it now, I think it is legitimate to ask ourselves whether the budget as it is conceived now is addressing or will be able to address the challenges we're seeing now. We all know the challenges: defense, security, competitiveness, access to what we need, labor, raw material, critical technologies. Is the EU budget addressing those challenges at the EU level? I think it is sound to actually ask ourselves this question. And the President has been answering already partially this answer. She said in her political guidelines, we need a new budget fit for our ambition. The first lesson we can draw, I think, from the last 5 years is that the EU budget is a very useful instrument. The EU budget has been essential in our answer to the crisis we went through. And this is new. The EU budget was not thought, conceived, designed as a crisis response instrument. This time it's been. And so the first lesson I think we can draw is the fact that we should focus our budget on our priorities because it matters. And this is where we have probably a change to do to conceive our budget more, even more, as a policy-based budget against a program-based budget. And this is probably one of the first lessons of the last 5 years. The need to ensure consistency across the different EU objectives would be facilitated by a policy-based budget. We need to build on the synergies. We need to make sure that the different elements that we are funding are self-reinforcing. Second lesson, probably, we need a simpler budget. We have grown too complex. We have 52 programs today. A lot of them finance the same thing. Think about infrastructure or clean technologies. But they do finance those very important elements with different eligibility rules, with different possibility to combine them or not, with different reporting rules. And we are here not as efficient as we could be. So simplicity simplifying has to be an objective in itself. We need to be faster, we need to be simpler, we need to be more certain so that we ease the access to EU funding for the beneficiaries. This has to be there because, for example, when you look at the recovery plans we had and the US answer, one of the biggest criticism was not even the size or what we were funding or not, was the speed and the simplicity. So I think we have to rethink a bit our budget in this direction to be more efficient. And for that, a single set of rules, a single plan for each country, linking reforms and investment, focusing on joint priorities will help. Third lesson, we need to maximize the impact. We need to be more impactful with our budget. And for that, we need to recognize that the MFF will never be the alpha and the omega of everything. It cannot do it all, and it should not do it all. The EU budget should focus on where we have value added, on where we bring positive externalities, on where, when we invest in one part of the EU, it serves the entire EU. And this is something that we have to make a renewed effort in this new world to assess where the EU value added is and to focus our budget there. And finally, and maybe even the most important lesson, our EU budget should be more flexible, should be more adaptable. Think about it. We designed the last budget in 2018. when we came to actually discuss it in 2020, none of the challenges we were facing at the time were thought back in 2018. Think about this today. We are September 2024. We will present the new EU budget for 7 years in a year time. 1 year. 2 years for negotiation, 3 years. Maybe 1 or 2 years to negotiate different programs, 5 years. What we are talking about now will actually reach the ground in 5 years. If you look back, 5 years, none of what we are discussing were actually discussed. Of course not COVID, of course not Ukraine, of course not the energy crisis we're in, none of that. So we have to recognize this essential fact that what we are talking today might not be the world in 5 years. So we have to have the flexibility in this budget to adapt to the new circumstances that will inevitably emerge when this budget starts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think these 4 priorities that you mentioned, I think are very well made, and I really hope that not just the new Commission, but even more importantly, national leaders will listen to that. But let's hear now some views from we have 2 member states representatives, so very pleased to have you in alphabetic order, so Mr. Barbieri. So again, focusing on the composition and the size of the budget. So what would you recommend the next commissioner? What kind of proposal should she or he make?
Okay, thank you. I have to say that the budget is not really a competence of the Treasury, so I will try to relay some personal observations and what I understand is the view of our government at this early stage in the negotiation. And first of all, I would like to perhaps reiterate something that Stéphanie Rizzo said. This is something very important. The debate we are starting is a medium to long-term debate. Because if you think about it, the years in which the decisions that will be taken with this budget will come to fruition is not even the lifetime of this commission, is the following one. So it's the period ending in 2034. I think I'll be long retired by then. But I do care deeply about what will happen then. And I think it's important that today we look at, we try to discuss, first of all, what are the priorities of the European Union in light of what we know today, obviously, and leaving flexibility for things that might emerge. Now, someone could say, well, we knew that there was a risk of pandemics. We knew that there was a problem with Russia. Perhaps we look the other way. So I would suggest that, first of all, there should be a bit of blue sky thinking about even beyond the known unknowns and the obvious, to think about what will be the challenges. And I also think it's quite important that we do not forget the political dimension of things. There's no question that the consensus, the view, the European model is challenged in the voting booths. And we have seen it even in recent days. I'm not sure that we fully understand why this is the case. Is it a matter of insufficient security, job security, immigration? Is it the kind of welfare policies that we have followed? Is there a divide in the electorate between those who are getting the benefits and those who are still working at low wages? Is there a problem of wages being too low, of income redistribution? I think, we cannot think about the budget without looking at these issues. And the second is, and I'm stating the obvious, if we start talking about cohesion policy, agricultural policy, we need to realize that there are political considerations at play. Some lobbies, some social groups are quite strong. We cannot just say, okay, we're going to cut. An economist might suggest that, but when you think about the political implications, I mean, economists suggested, I think very rightly, that diesel should pay a higher excise duty than petrol, and look what happened in one of the member states once the government did the right thing. So clearly, when we look at common agricultural policy, which is clearly up there as I guess the biggest spending item on the budget, I would argue it would make sense to introduce more incentives or even constraints in terms of emissions, in terms of water pollution. But we need to be mindful of what will be the implications. Also, I thought it was interesting the suggestion that agricultural policy could be co-financed. Then we need to realize that there is a connection to the new fiscal rules. There are some countries that need to reduce their budget deficits quite significantly. And if you change CAP, make it co-financed, then you're adding, I guess, at least 0.2% to the deficit of GDP. So ideally, one would argue the obvious answer to your question is, first of all, let's rationalize, reduce the number of programs, try to be more effective, more efficient, and have an impact analysis of the various European programs. And that's within this 1% of GDP. And then as regards the rest, we need to have capacity to respond to unexpected crises, even with borrowing programs. We need to have a sequel to the NGEU program, but we have to be mindful, again, what are the constraints? Some countries are not in favor of doing so. So we need to determine very specifically what are these public goods, European public goods, where is the consensus about supporting them with a borrowing facility, and then have a program that's sufficiently as small as possible given the ambitious goals that we have. And I will also take the opportunity of saying that I think at some point there has to be a reflection on NGEU itself. Does it make sense to have this cutoff date in 2026 when we know in most countries there is progress on achieving milestones and targets, but there are delays in actually spending the resources? And this is not, I would say, it's not something specific to the European situation. If you look at, the news we are seeing about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, with this huge environmentally oriented program, they are also late in spending the money because sometimes you're venturing into something that has never been done before. So I think the first thing to say is we should think very carefully about the completion date of what we have at the moment and reflect on this combination of milestones, targets, but execution, and find some common ground. Because I think at one end you have the current cohesion fund approach. You spend, I pay you, I reimburse you from the EU budget. On the other side is you hit these milestones and targets, I give you the money, but I don't know if you actually open that research center until the research center becomes a target, which may be 1 or 2 years later. So perhaps there's a way to find the right combination, the right solution, or at least a better solution between these two models. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much also for bringing this issue of the way of financing, whether indeed a kind of performance-based or a cost-based approach could be somehow reconciled. And also thank you for bringing the European public goods issue to the table, which is absolutely crucial. There are lots of discussions. Also, several colleagues of mine in the room who have worked a lot on that. So maybe, Ms. De Haag, let me turn to you. and first ask how you see the current budget, basically this 1/3 agriculture, 1/3 cohesion, 1/3 everything else, and whether you think that this European public goods nature is sufficiently incorporated into the current or this existing close to 1% MFF. I mean, as Ms. Rizzo said, NGU added a lot to that, but the more permanent budget. So what's your views on that, please?
Thank you. Yeah, it works. Thank you very much for this discussion in this phase. I think it's very important to have this in this early stage to have our minds a bit broader than in the last phase of the discussion, probably. We have a new government, so I really have to stress that we're still of course, waiting for the proposal of the Commission. So for me, I will look back to how it went and also some of our observations. It's for sure where our government will stand if you talk about the financial position, but on the policy we haven't yet a position. But I can assure you, of course, I mean, as a Dutch, it would be really very strange not to say that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Because, you know, all public funding, financing is limited, and we should really be precise in how we have the architecture in place for the challenges we have. And I think Stefan already touched upon some really very valid points. I think the fiscal policy has cushioned really last time challenges of the pandemic and also high inflation shock, but it also gave us quite heavy fiscal burdens as well, and we have some really high debts to face, and in the same time we will have, and we already have, the challenges of the transition. We have the challenge of aging. We have, of course, our defense challenges. So at this background, there is a risk, of course, that we try to bring back the debt ratios that we're facing with, but that we can't resist the temptation to address this with debt-financed expenditures. So that's at least really a very important issue, just not to get that temptation. If you look at the size of MFF and Next Generation EU, and you can see there's a lot of money in the system, as Stefan already said, but there is also quite a lot of money that is still not spent, so implementation and also absorption capacity is a very important issue. How are we going to face and to make that better? If you look at what is needed, for sure it's very important to prioritize. At the moment we're in a national discussion on the budget. I won't touch upon that one because that's I shouldn't be allowed. But it's for sure. It brings a lot of really difficult choices and priorities that are important for the long-term challenges we're facing. And so it's important to do that as well at European level. Common debt, I already heard it for a couple of times. It's really a sensitive issue in our country. I can be sure about that, and that it was and it will stay like that. To structurally use this to finance debt and deficit of that's really a hard discussion. So it should really focus on the European Union added value, and I think I heard from both sides, the public goods, at least it's important to discuss what is important for the future and to have the right priorities and focus on what are the cross-border investments that are needed for the challenges we face. So I'm also very grateful for the paper of Bruegel. And also, I think Stephanie already touched upon the flexibility, the need for flexibility. You see it's very rigid at the moment, and we should have more flexibility in this. That's really an important lesson we had last time, of the last few years. And then also I think we should have a closer look to the efficiency of where do we put our money and how is it spent in a proper way. So modernization, flexibilization and the simplification are important. Make it simple, make it more how do you say that it's more easy to use is important for having this added value. Then I heard Ricardo saying we will have nice discussions and open discussions as we always have on the Next Generation EU. It's a one-off instrument, and the date we should really observe this end date of 2026, which is important, and we attach great importance to that. But the RRF, the positive element, of course, of the incentives for structural reforms, we look with big interest on what the final verdict or final view will be on how it has not yet proven, but how will the reforms, how will these be implemented? We'll be very interested to see at the end of time. But it's a very interesting model to explore, performance-based, and the conditional reforms included rule of law is interesting to explore more. And of course we're looking closely how should it then safeguard reaching policy goals and also protect our financial interests of the EU. And then maybe, because we always talk about public funding, public financing, but we then forget. I come from the economic department, and I've experienced how important it is that there is this really well capital markets union for scaling up companies, and also to have a stronger position and a bigger independence, vice versa the US and other trade partners. And also the excellence is important in this respect. So how can we have excellence in innovation to make our competitiveness stronger? This is a really important issue, I think, for the future as well. If you look at the challenges we're facing, competitiveness is our way to also lessen the dependencies we have. And besides capital markets union, the single market in general, it's very important. Look at the energy market. If we make it stronger, it lowers prices. And that does something with our competitiveness. Yeah, well, and we have also really very good alternative financing options like the EIB, which we find very interesting as well. So besides the public finance, we really should take care that we see the broader picture in this respect. I think that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. also for expressing some skepticism about common debt, which is certainly an important view. But I also very much appreciated that you focused on the EU value added and cross-border investments and also some measures beyond the EU budget like CMU and the single market. Also, the absorption, I think, was absolutely crucial. The point you raised that countries are relatively slow in absorbing all kinds of EU money, including next generation EU. So, Stephanie, I might come back to you with that question, but first let me turn to Pascal. And so far we broadly talked about what kind of spending we should make, but I would like to change a little bit discussion on the revenue side, not least because you have written the tax memo in our book of memos. And my question to you is that, do you see options for new sources of financing the EU budget, in particular, which wouldn't take revenues away from member states? Because also, I mean, as Ricardo emphasized, a number of countries will have to do quite sizable fiscal adjustments in the years to come. So if there is any proposal to increase the size of the EU budget, like we made in our memo, then obviously member states will have to contribute more, and certainly they might find it difficult if at the same time they have to consolidate a lot. So what kind of new revenue sources would you see to the EU budget? And is there a free lunch in a sense, which would only generate revenues to the EU, but wouldn't take revenues away from member states?
No free lunch to start with. And the question actually echoes what has just been discussed on European public goods. We should project ourselves in that area where you are on a pure EU level thinking and what has spillovers across the Union. So I think there is a link between how to raise revenue and how to put ourselves in that logic of European public goods, as you're well described in the budget memo. So the first aspect of your question is the EU hunting on the same land as the countries in terms of revenue raising? The answer is yes, fundamentally yes. And that's why the budget is largely now fed with statistically based resources. These are not taxes. These are taxes on countries, and the issue with that is you move to a net contribution thinking or approach. I want my money back, this is my contribution, this is my feedback, and I identify the difference. And this is one of the main issues. And the genuine on resource originally, which was the custom duties, they have reduced considerably. So we're left with the VAT statistically based resource and the GNI resource. So what can be done in the true space of taxation, which would not be in competition with members? That's the question. I don't have the answer, but I will still try to provide some elements. Where is the money today? Okay, the money is on consumption. Well, the member states, I think, are already eating a lot of that. I'm not sure there is much more room to increase VAT, or for the European Union, in addition to the statistically based resource, to take something out of that. Not to mention the social impact or the distributional impact. I think we've raised the point where consumption taxes, that's where the money is, but it is collected. Okay? So where else is the money? Well, I believe that, and that's the proposal by the Commission, which I think is sensible, the money is on carbon, on emissions. And that meets a European public good, which is to reduce emissions and to have a contribution to fight climate change. So here you have both a resource, revenue raising, on the one hand, and a public good on the other hand. Now, the difficulty as I would say with a French accent, right, is les gilets jaunes. Every time you try to touch this pot of money, you have an issue. What can be done? Well, the EU is leading here with the ETS. It is happening. You are the leading region in the world in an extremely smart way because you have spillovers with the ETS, now with the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. With the CBAM, you protect a bit from the leakage on the one hand, but more importantly, you oblige other countries to think what they do. Would a big exporter of goods impacted by the ETS and the CBAM in Europe, would they let the European Union collect the tax, or would they tax themselves? And that makes me think of something we did at the OECD a few years ago, and which now is being implemented, which is a global minimum tax of 15% on companies. If one country doesn't collect it, the US may not, unless they change their mind, the European Union will collect it on American companies. So you have an incentive for other countries to collect. And that is a genuine own resource, which makes sense, which meets the objective of the European public goods, and where there is money. So that's one. And the proposal, the latest proposal by the Commission, I think, is to take 30% of that. There are distributional impacts within the European Union, and that's where balancing it, it's not a tax, but balancing it with the other proposal by the EU Commission of a new statistically based resource based on a proxy of profit of companies, a way to recognize that getting a harmonized corporate income tax within the European Union, which would feed the EU budget, maybe for, I mean, my grandkids. But for the time being, we can approach there, and that balances the distributional impact. What else can be done in this area? Probably more. I don't know whether it's at the EU level or at the member states level, but reflecting on the progressivity of carbon taxation may be a way to address the yellow vest, and I believe there is room for that. Or focusing on the low-hanging fruit, and I see two of them, and they are part of the ETS, but the EU can play a leading role at the International Maritime Organization to tax shipping. Shipping is exempt from corporate income tax. Shipping is exempt from kerosene fuel taxes. They pay nothing, nowhere, and they make some significant profit, or at least they made post-COVID some profit. So here, you can do something. Can you mutualize this as EU budget? Probably yes, at least 30% as ETS or through a dedicated mechanism. Aviation is also part of the next generation of ETS. Aviation is exempt, basically. We can tax it. So these are the low-hanging fruit. Finally, and that's more, I mean, forward-looking, where is the money? I could say, in English you would say, with the high net worth individuals. In French, we're more brutal. We say, avec les riches, with the rich, okay? So you have a lot of money in a few hands. So being able to better tax capital may be an overall policy of the European Union through directives that would be implemented by member states. But why not thinking of a global EU tax on the richest of the rich, with some form of external borders of the European Union? I think the EU has been too naive over the past 30, 40 years, not having its own external border. A tax system functions well when it is protected from leakage. That's how they were built at the national level. If we want to move at the EU level, maybe that's what we should conceive, and I believe there is room, and external borders, it's like CBAM, could be mutualized at the EU level.
Thank you, Pascal. Even though you didn't say free lunches, I think you said a couple of options, as you call them, low-hanging fruit, like shipping and aviation, and also at least a European wealth tax on the very rich, protected by the borders, is a good idea. Now, time is running, so I would very quickly but shortly like to turn to questions and answers. So let me also encourage the online audience to go to slido.com and type #budget and ask your questions. And also from the room, I will immediately go to you. But first, Stephanie, a very quick reaction on why the absorption of the Recovery and Resilience Facility is so low. You might also know that the European Court of Auditors published a report just 2 days ago, and they were very critical about it.
I don't think this is low, actually. This is, I think, the first element that we should be discussing. The RRF, this facility, was conceived as a recovery plan to one problem, which was, basically the economic consequences of COVID, which were dramatic, we should remember. And this was conceived as a recovery program, not only as helicopter money, dropping the money on the member states for them just to survive the lockdowns, because that was one option that was considered at the time, you will remember with me. But it was conceived as a recovery program that will help, the Americans said, build back better. So the idea was we will inject the money in the member states to fix their vulnerabilities in terms of structural reforms and to incentivize investment in the areas that mattered: green, digital, social resilience, and the rest of it. A full program were designed in record times. Implementation started. And then 1 year later, we had the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine, as we all know, had massive consequences on the of course, in terms of security, defense, and human point of view, but also on the macroeconomic environment. We have seen after that energy prices we've never seen before. We have seen inflation and interest rates at levels that we had not seen for decades. And this has changed the environment in which the plans had been designed. There was a need to refocus those plans. That's what we've done with Repower EU, to accelerate the independence of our member states from dependencies on Russian gas, and to accelerate the green transition. So we went back to the drawing board, redesigned and refixed the plans, taking into account this accelerated objective, plus the new macroeconomic environment. And this took a bit of time. So if you look at the fact that basically we had to design those plans twice nearly in a couple of years, and when you look at what has been achieved already, in particular in terms of reforms, I, on a personal basis, do not agree with the fact that this has been slow. And also, what does that mean? It also is a demonstration of the fact that both the countries and the Commission and the member states are taking this very seriously. We're not just throwing the money at things. We make sure that what we agreed is delivered on. And yes, sometimes it may take a bit more time. But what matters is that there is confidence, and I think the RRF has been building this confidence back, that the EU budget funding is actually spent on what we agreed to spend it on, with certainty, because we do check. And I think this is an important element. So there has been some objective circumstances that have rendered the implementation more difficult. We should also remember that the Commission proposal was slightly longer than 2026. It's been reduced by member states. Whether the deadline is the appropriate deadline is a different conversation. It's been discussed politically. It was maybe right at the time. Maybe we need to rediscuss, I don't know. But the fact that we are criticizing this instrument now, saying it's too slow, I find it a bit strange, in fact, because the speed is not what matters. The results is what matters. And I think in terms of results, it has achieved much more than a lot of different instruments we had in the past. I'm very confident that when we do the assessment that you were calling for, Helen, in terms of impact of this facility, we will see that it has resulted in more reforms than any of our other instruments. And in terms of investments, it would have delivered on focusing the investment on what we think is important, for example, the green. So I do believe that it's pretty successful, and we still have 2 years to go. So I actually find it, the criticism legitimate, but a bit on the harsh side.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We indeed look forward to an assessment of once the RF is over. Now, let me turn to you, everyone in the room, and also there are already lots of questions online. So let me start with people in the room. I see many hands. So let me start with those who volunteer to sit in the first row. So please be very brief. Introduce yourself and be very, very brief because time is very short.
Jakub Gorzkowski, PGE. Mrs. Rizzo, you've mentioned that we should expect a proposal from the Commission within a year. More precisely, should we expect it before the summer or after the summer? And regarding the RRF money, I fully agree with you, Mr. Barberi, that there is a need to shift the deadline, but still we can assume that some money will be left. So I have a general question to all of you, the panelists. Do you think that this money that will be left should be spent to pay back the debt, or should we reinvest it to the same purpose or different purpose within the new or the same instrument? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then the gentleman there.
Filippo Favan, Center for Global Transformation Studies. Thanks for a very open discussion. Stephanie, you've touched the topic of the European Union bonds. And my question, apparently European capital market lacks the volume. And can these bonds become an efficient instrument to fuel the scaling up, like in the US, especially given strategic needs European Union has for now? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, please.
Hi, Andreas Graf from the think tank Agora Energiewende, and my question would be on the ETS2 carbon pricing instrument that was introduced in the Fit for 55 package. It was one of the main accomplishments on introducing carbon pricing potentially over the coming years. Can we expect finance ministries in that context to be a bulwark against rolling it back, or will they be among those to bury it?
Thank you. Then I saw my colleague Lucio Bank wanted to ask a question. If anyone, please raise your hand so that I see. Okay.
Before discussing the follow-up of NGU, one should think about the legacy of it. In terms of debt, both economic theory and I would add common sense suggest that debt should be service over the future, but not to be repaid when it comes to a public actor. In particular, the idea of the EU becoming an issuer, an important one, contrasts with the idea that the debt has to be reduced to zero. So what is the real end game there?
Thank you. And there was someone over there, and then I ask a question online and give the chance to the panelists. So, please.
Yes, thank you. Konstantinos Zanetis from the Cypriot representation in Brussels. Just wanted to ask, perhaps to comment on the sort of proposal in the morning that the common agricultural policy could be also financed, Pillar 1, also co-financed by the member states. Whether this could be possible and if it's examined by the Commission, and whether there are any sort of examination on how to expand the RRF plans or projects in the future, and any comments from any of you. Thank you.
Thank you. And there is a very popular question with 16 votes now on how will the EU budget ensure that strategic technologies are funded to enhance EU competitiveness. So lots of questions. Maybe we can Pascal, start with you to take the reverse order. If there's any question you would like to respond.
Well, only one on the revenue side, which is on carbon pricing. Can we expect finance ministers to move ahead? We'll see. I mean, politically, it's radioactive. Every time you touch it, you have an issue. Thus, the fact that it's not a tax, it's an ETS. And will it move? Yes, it will. I believe so. What can be done to increase the pace here and to square the circle, maybe this idea of progressivity. And when you look at progressivity on carbon emission, the first candidate is aviation. That's where you can see that the consumption of carbon increases massively across the sides. So I believe there are avenues, but we're set. We have a trajectory, and it is happening now. It's for the finance ministers to agree that 30% of that would feed the European Union with the distributional impact across the different regions or across the different countries.
Thank you very much. Helen, can I turn to you? So any question you would like to answer, or any final remark?
Yeah, some of them I couldn't really hear well. There was somebody asking about the scaling up, but I couldn't hear it properly. Could you repeat it? Do you have it? Yeah.
I believe that was my question. The question was about the European Union bonds. Can it be potentially, like the US bonds, an instrument to scaling up the capital markets in Europe? As an instrument to make it bigger, since in the United States, obviously, it's the biggest instrument to place the funds in.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I already touched upon how we stand in these kind of instruments, but I think for scaling up, it's really very important to have instruments and like EIB, but also Horizon, and having this excellence criteria in place. And that worked really very well, but for really scaling up, we've seen that the importance of the capital markets union is key in this respect. If you look at the active role in the US and compared to Europe, it's a big difference. So it would be more, I would more look at such an instrument than yours.
I saw a lady raising her hand, so since there were no questions from women, just please, I give the floor to you quickly.
I think it's working. Thank you, Paula Tama with the Financial Times. I wanted to ask to the ladies on the panel if there is a relationship between flexibility, both in terms of being able to move the various headings, if there will be headings, or just priorities, the money around where it's needed in the duration of the budget, and the size. So do you think that a bigger budget isn't necessary if we have a more flexible budget? That's my question. Thanks.
Thank you. Would you like to answer?
Yes. Well, it wouldn't surprise you that I would say we should first start to discuss what is needed, and then look at the size of the budget. And flexibility within the current budget is actually our starting point. I mean, it's important to see how we can, with flexibility, use our money in a better way.
Thank you. Ricardo, please.
Just a couple of quick comments. One is on resources. I agree with both Pascal and Stephanie, their comments, so I will not repeat what they said about carbon taxes, CBAM, and so on. I also think that on a topic on which Pascal has worked, which is the global corporate tax reform, where we have a risk that Pillar 1 will not be approved, that has implications because we have a number of European countries that have a digital services tax, which at some point would have been replaced by Pillar 1. So this tax on multinationals based on the markets where they actually realize their turnover. Now, it would make sense, and it's a bit difficult to explain why there's been this hesitancy from some countries to think about a European digital services tax, at least as a stopgap until we get, hopefully at some point, this global tax reform approved. And that could provide some additional resources for these own resources, which could help increase the size of the EU budget without displacing revenue bases of member states. Or at least in this particular case, we know that at the moment the DST is, in most countries, producing revenues that are relatively small. Now, in terms of the questions about EU bonds, I think the question that Lucio and others asked, but particularly Lucio, is if we pay down all the debt, then by 2058 there will be no EU bond market, essentially. And is it useful to think of developing the EU bond market? I would definitely say so. Even in the perspective that gradually these European public goods would be financed at the European level. And also think about the potential for the European Central Bank to carry out open market operations on the EU bonds. So it all fits together. So in moderation, of course, without expanding unduly the debt of the European Union, but we think it really makes sense to have a strategy that involves a substantial amount and possibly growing to the extent that they would replace national financing for European projects. And that includes also, there's been another question about technological innovation. It's clear that in that field you have economies of scale. It's clear that in the field of innovation, basic research, applied research, we can only compete with the US and China if we merge our resources. It doesn't make sense to have duplication of projects, both in innovation and in defense, when we are competing against the giants, and there's been a consolidation process even in the US industry, as we know. There is another question there.
Helen, a very quick response.
Yeah, because I realized I didn't react on of course, the own resources, and that we have to see. We judge every proposal in that respect on its merits. But just to explain how the GNA-based model is also a good one, because it's predictable, it's stable, it's fair. So that's just good to mention. And it has its balancing, budget balancing role. And maybe as just a last thing, we should really be aware that with our own resources, we do not have to risk that our competitiveness, our economic growth is stifled because of instruments like taxes. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So Stefanie, we are already 3 minutes over time. Yeah. So I ask you to meet the challenge of responding very, very quickly, please.
Okay. Very, very quickly. Date of the MFF, we will have to see. Their legal deadline says July 2025, but if you look at the last proposal, 2018, we did not respect the legal deadline. No one died. We'll see. What's left in the RRF? We could spend another 3 hours discussing on that, but I will only recall the actual legal environment. And the actual legal environment of the RRF says, if the money is not used by 2026, then the money is lost. And that means that the money is not raised in the market. So basically, it reduces the debt that would have been repaid later on. But it cannot be, we cannot borrow to repay the debt, right? So, I mean, it's just lost in the current environment. On the question of the EU bonds, and can that add to the volume? Yes, it does add to the volume. I take half a minute to answer to this one because I think that's a fact which is not very known yet. Back in 2019, the EU was already an issuer. We had 50 billion outstanding debt. We were raising 150 million per year. Today, we have 500 billion outstanding debt going to 1 trillion by 2026. We will be raising about 150 plus minus billion a year in the next years. We are making a massive change in the euro area capital market. this is clear. We're becoming the 5th largest issuer. We provide this stable, safe asset. It does make a difference. It does add to volumes. The feedback we get, and I don't go into any political consideration. I don't even go into any legal consideration. I'm just saying that everywhere we go, we hear the investors worldwide asking for more because they want to buy Europe, especially in the current geographical and geopolitical environment, and this EU bond is practical. So for them, the feedback we get from the financial industry is, please continue. But we know, to Lucio's question, I'm not going into the economic theory, not even common sense, Lucio, I'm just sticking to the legal, and the legal says this debt will have to be repaid between 2028 and 2058, and unless this change, this is what is going to happen. And just one word on this one. We don't know the speed at which the debt has to be reimbursed. There is no legal provision on this one. But if we just take the most stupid assumption of a linear reimbursement between 28 and 2058, if we take the assumption that the whole RRF is consumed, and if we look a bit, if we do basic assumptions in terms of interest rates, we will face more or less 30 billion of reimbursement per year for Next-Gen EU. 30 billion per year as of 28. This is twice the 7-year budget for security and defense we have today. Gives you a sense of the needs. And actually gives you a lot of sense of why we need to discuss revenue side of the budget. Not only new on resources, but the revenue side of the budget is going to be extremely, extremely important. What else did I want? Common agricultural policy, co-financing, is that a possibility? It is a possibility. Everything is a possibility. What is important is that in the next MFF, we do have, and I join up Ellen there, to think about how the EU budget basically leverage on the rest. And so the articulation with the national budget, the articulation with the other public bodies like the EIB, for example, will be essential so that the critical mass of public funding is enlarged. So we will have to design the MFF to create those incentives for the private sector, for the national budget, and for the other international bodies. Should there be a follow-up to the RRF plans? I think we've discussed that in the sense that clearly some of the features of the RRF have to remain. Reform and investment, linking back to the EU policies, EU objectives in a tighter manner, having a whole of government, whole of policies approach, paying on deliveries, all that are very interesting features that we have to reflect on when designing the next budget. I should stop.
Yes, thank you so much. You did really well, answering very quickly a large number of questions. And my very last task is to thank all of you, all the participants here in the room, which is fully packed, everyone online, and also in particular our 4 excellent panelists for following this very interesting discussion. So thank you very much. There's the lunch break now, which for us will be a bit shorter, and then we rejoin at 1 p.m. Thank you.